Leslie McGuire never wanted attention. After a decade of managing high-profile landscape projects for commercial buildings in downtown Portland, she had burned out from the performative meetings, the constant pitching, and the daily battle with developers who wanted green only for the marketing. She left it all behind after her divorce, an amicable but soul-stripping process that made her crave silence, privacy, and ownership. Not just of property, but of her choices, her energy, her breath. So, when she found the modest two-story house tucked on a quiet suburban cul-de-sac 2 hours outside the city, she knew it wasn't the beauty of the structure or the view that called to her. It was the slope of the land. It faced west. It caught the rain, and in Oregon, that meant everything. In the weeks before she moved in, Leslie drafted blueprints, not for the house, which she planned to leave mostly untouched, but for what would lie beneath it and around it. A self-sustaining rainwater collection system integrated into a layered, native plant garden. It wasn't just eco-consciousness, it was sovereignty. The system was clean, efficient, and silent. Large subterranean tanks would hold water filtered through gravel and carbon. Capillary-style piping would distribute it to a grid of raised beds and perennial zones. She wasn't reinventing the wheel. She was just using gravity and logic. Her permits were in order. A registered plumber handled the underground work, and all the backflow systems met code. If anyone bothered to check, everything would pass scrutiny. Her neighbors didn't seem to mind at first. The first week she moved in, a few waved as she unloaded her tools and gear. An older man from 2 houses down stopped to compliment the rockwork she'd begun outlining along the edge of her yard. Leslie smiled, nodded, and kept working. Her interactions remained polite but shallow by design. She wasn't trying to make friends. She was building something she could control. Then came the woman across the street. Karen Aldridge was not loud, nor was she obvious, at least not at first. She was precise. Her lawn was cut with military uniformity, her shutters painted an immaculate beige that matched the driveway trim. Her garbage cans never lingered curbside longer than 10 minutes past pickup. Leslie noticed, of course, and she sensed immediately that Karen noticed her too. Not in a neighborly way, not even in a curious way, but in that manner of people who believe their job is to catalog deviation. It started with glances. Then it became pauses. Karen would stand at the end of her driveway, adjusting the collar on her windbreaker while her eyes lingered on Leslie's newly installed water access panel, the kind mounted flush with the soil. Or she'd walk her dog a second time in the evening, circling just a little closer, letting her gaze drift over the still unfinished section of piping that connected Leslie's collection basin to the underground reservoir. Leslie never offered explanations. Karen never asked. Not directly. But on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the final inspection had been signed off, a city code officer knocked on Leslie's door with a clipboard and a neutral smile. Someone had anonymously reported an unlicensed irrigation installation that might be leaking gray water into the neighborhood drainage. Leslie didn't flinch. She showed the officer the permits. She walked him through the entire system. He nodded, took notes, and left with a shrug. The next day, someone dropped a manila envelope in her mailbox. No return address, just a single sheet of paper printed in large type. Watch it. No signature, no threat, but unmistakable in intent. Karen didn't wave that day. She didn't even look over. Leslie didn't call the police. She didn't panic. She went inside, boiled water for tea, and opened her laptop. She reviewed her schematics, checked the logs from her soil moisture sensors, and began to map behavioral patterns. She wasn't being paranoid, she was just being thorough. There was no crime in preparing for escalation. She didn't believe in waiting until something exploded. Leslie had learned, through years of navigating corporate sabotage, subtle undermining, and boardroom deception, that quiet hostility was rarely quiet for long. It metastasized. The next rainfall arrived 3 days later. As usual, the system performed flawlessly. Leslie watched as the gutters carried runoff through the filtration layer, watched the tank's internal readouts climb in her app, watched the automated routing slowly push water into the north bed of her yard. Everything worked. Everything was clean. She went to bed feeling steadier than she had in days. By morning, the system was dead. The diagnostic screen showed an abnormal pressure drop in the main inflow line, a physical obstruction, not a malfunction. Leslie pulled on her jacket, went outside, and lifted the main access cover. Someone had jammed a thick wad of insulation material, spongy, soiled, clearly shoved with intent, into the intake. Water had backed up. The lower tank was dry. No signs of break-in, no damage to the hatch. No camera caught the act. Whoever had done it had known precisely when to act and how to avoid detection. Leslie stood motionless for a long moment, the air sharp with the scent of wet pine and rust. She wasn't angry. She was calculating. She cleaned the blockage herself. She resecured the hatch, added a discrete vibration sensor to its base, and returned inside. Then she waited. Not passively, but actively. Checking records, drafting a log of every anomaly no matter how small. Strange tire marks by her curb, a sudden shift in garbage pickup order, a shadow on her back fence that hadn't been there before. None of it was proof. All of it was pattern. Karen, meanwhile, resumed her performances of passive stillness. Dog walks lingered longer. The garden hose across her driveway was dragged deliberately into the shared easement space. When another neighbor installed a decorative bird bath on their lawn, Karen was quick to appear with a printed list of mosquito control guidelines. She had, clearly, expanded her focus. But Leslie didn't respond. She built, in silence. Every layer of her property was now purposeful. The plants she chose weren't just pretty. They were dense, thorned, and grew in strategic barriers. The lighting along her walkways was solar-triggered and motion-sensitive, but tuned only to detect shapes above 5 feet. The secondary overflow line of her water system was rerouted, not as a threat, not as a weapon, but as a countermeasure. Because while Leslie still didn't want attention, she had come to understand that sometimes, in the quietest corners of suburbia, the most dangerous thing you could do was refuse to play the game. And someone like Karen, someone who had learned to hold power through reputation and implication, was never going to let that stand. Not quietly, not forever. The first real shift came without warning, though in retrospect it had been circling for days, like a hawk tracing slow arcs above the field before its dive. Leslie woke to the sound of running water, not inside her house, not a burst pipe or forgotten faucet, but outside, faint, steady, rhythmic. She stepped onto her back porch in slippers and a hoodie, breath catching against the cold morning air, and froze. Across the street, Karen's yard looked like a war zone. Every sprinkler on her property was spraying in full blast, spinning wildly, flooding her lawn, driveway, and even parts of the sidewalk. It had rained the night before, hard, and the ground was already soaked. Now, torrents of water coursed down her carefully edged lawn and pooled around the storm drains. It wasn't just overwatering. It was an active overflow. Leslie watched, eyebrows furrowed as Karen emerged from her house in a robe and house shoes, shouting something unintelligible at her irrigation system. She waved her phone like a wand and knelt down near the main valve near her garage, fidgeting with the control panel, cursing loud enough to echo through the cul-de-sac. No one else came out to help. No one else seemed to notice. Karen disappeared inside again, and for a long while, the water kept running. Later that day, the city utility crew arrived. 2 workers in navy coveralls dragging orange cones and a portable diagnostics rig. They poked around her front yard for nearly an hour. Karen stood nearby, arms folded, tapping her foot with the slow, aggravated rhythm of someone who needed a scapegoat. Leslie observed from behind her blinds, silent. She didn't know what Karen had told them, but she had a strong suspicion it wasn't the truth. That suspicion was confirmed the following morning when an envelope appeared taped to Leslie's front door. It was thick, the paper unusually stiff, like it had been chosen for formality. Inside was a printed letter, formatted like an official warning, though from no recognizable government body. The header simply read, "Neighborhood Oversight," with no logo. The language was vague but pointed. Recent inspections have indicated irregularities in non-standard water routing between your property and adjacent parcels. Inappropriate redirection of excess water runoff may constitute a violation of shared infrastructure expectations. Leslie read it 3 times, then folded it and slid it into her desk drawer without a word. It wasn't official. It wasn't even enforceable. But it was the first documented accusation, and it had Karen's fingerprints all over it. Not literally, of course, but in tone, in style, in its smug attempt to sound authoritative without bearing the weight of actual law. She didn't respond. Instead, she called the registered contractor who had installed her system, asked him to run a full diagnostic of the overflow routing, and requested a printed copy of the original plumbing blueprints with his certification stamp included. He didn't ask why. He knew the game. She also contacted a civil engineer from the county's stormwater division, someone she'd met years ago at a sustainability seminar, and arranged for a site visit. The engineer came on a Tuesday afternoon, walked the property with quiet precision, took photos, and issued a summary report. System is self-contained, no evidence of unauthorized redirection. Downhill runoff conforms to topography. Karen saw them walking the property. She was out on her front step again, this time pretending to sweep dry leaves into a pile that didn't exist. Leslie ignored her. That same evening, her motion sensors pinged. Not unusual. Raccoons and neighborhood cats often triggered the system. But this time, the camera feed showed something different. A silhouette. Human. Not trying to hide, but also not behaving naturally. Slow, deliberate steps across the edge of her property, just outside the reach of her central lighting. A hooded figure moved toward the back corner of her lot, paused for several long seconds near the overflow line, and then disappeared into the shadows. Leslie didn't chase them. She reviewed the footage, extracted stills, and filed a police report, not expecting action but establishing a record. She emailed the video file to herself, uploaded it to cloud storage, and added a hard copy to the binder that now lived on her kitchen counter, right next to the fruit bowl. A different kind of harvest. The next day, she returned home from a grocery run and found her back gate wide open. Nothing taken, nothing moved. Just the gate, normally locked from the inside, swinging gently in the wind. The latch wasn't broken, but someone had tampered with it. The screws had been loosened and retightened just slightly out of alignment. A message. She resecured the lock and added a second internal latch, the kind used for livestock enclosures. Quiet, strong, and inconspicuous. Karen, meanwhile, began walking her dog 3 times a day instead of 2. Each route, each lap around the cul-de-sac, paused for exactly 30 seconds in front of Leslie's driveway. Not long enough to be confronted, just long enough to suggest possession. On Thursday, Leslie received a letter in the mail, not taped but mailed properly, postmarked from a neighboring town. It was from a private legal firm she didn't recognize, stating that her property had been named in an inquiry involving water damage to an adjacent home and that further action might follow pending technical verification. No lawsuit, no formal. Complaint, just a warning. The timing wasn't random. Leslie did not panic. She made appointments. She spoke with a property attorney who reviewed the legal letter and shrugged. Intimidation, she said flatly. Nothing actionable, but worth documenting. Leslie nodded, added it to the folder. Then came the rainfall. A strong, relentless storm. 2 days of thick clouds and hammering sheets of water. Leslie's system responded perfectly. The tanks filled in sequence. The filters held. The routing grid cycled cleanly. She stood in the mud behind her house under a hooded poncho and watched the garden drink. And then, for the second time in a month, the system shut down. But this time, not at her end. Instead, Leslie saw water bubbling up from beneath the eastern fence, Karen's side, and seeping under the boundary line. It was flowing from the other direction, unfiltered, unchanneled. Her side was dry. Karen's yard was flooding, from below. The next morning, Karen was outside again, this time not in control, but in chaos. Her basement had flooded. Her backyard was submerged. She shouted at the utility workers who arrived, waved papers, accused. Leslie heard snippets from across the lawn. Backflow, irrigation failure, unauthorized connection. But she didn't step outside. She didn't have to, because this time she hadn't done anything. And now the problem had reversed. The water wasn't hers. The damage wasn't hers. The system wasn't compromised. But the boundary had been. And Karen had crossed it first. By the end of that week, the air between Leslie and Karen felt like it had its own gravitational field, a slow, invisible force that made the neighborhood feel subtly tilted. Everything looked the same on the surface. Kids rode bikes, delivery vans passed through, the same couple walked their greyhounds around the block, but every time Leslie stepped outside, she could feel the shift. It was in the way windows opened slightly when she came home, or how the couple who had once waved now stared too long and said nothing. She had become the subject of a silent vote, and no one had told her what the ballot was. The damage to Karen's basement turned out to be significant. Multiple crews arrived over the course of a few days. Plumbers, waterproofing specialists, someone with a ground radar scanner. Leslie watched from her upstairs office as the front yard across the street was carved open with machines, hoses, plastic sheeting, and furious gesturing. Karen didn't scream or cry. She directed. She stalked the crews like a foreman on the brink of a labor dispute, pointing to things that didn't make sense, demanding answers from people who barely looked her in the eye. By Monday, a large blue tarp covered half of Karen's lawn. Her sprinklers were gone. Her dog, once a reliable presence on its leash, was nowhere to be seen. Leslie had said nothing. She hadn't gloated, hadn't intervened, hadn't even mentioned the flooding to anyone. But that restraint did not spare her from retaliation. It started small again. On Tuesday morning, a utility notice was left on Leslie's door, an alert about upcoming service disruptions due to a maintenance update. But the flag on her water meter had not been disturbed, and her neighbors hadn't received the same notice. Curious, she called the number listed, only to find that the reference code didn't exist in their system. It wasn't a prank. It was precision harassment, meant to rattle, not amuse. 2 days later, someone left a plastic bag filled with dead leaves and mud on her porch. No note, no markings, just mess. Leslie bagged it with gloved hands, documented it, and disposed of it. The next day, she found a scratch along the driver's side panel of her truck. Not deep, but deliberate, curving in an arc like a half-hearted keying attempt. It was too vague to report, too specific to ignore. That weekend, she left town for a scheduled speaking engagement at a green infrastructure conference. It was a quiet, professional event. No cameras, no social media, just panels of academics and specialists discussing watershed management and climate resilience. Leslie gave a 20-minute talk about decentralized systems and then drove home in the early evening, tired but centered. She pulled into her driveway and knew immediately something was off. The scent hit her first. Sharp. Chemical. She rushed to the back of the house and stopped dead. The rear quarter of her garden was scorched brown. Leaves shriveled, soil blackened, a distinct chemical trail leading from the overflow valve to the center of her southern bed. It looked like someone had poured bleach or pesticide into the release zone. There were no footprints, no broken gates. Whoever did it knew where to walk, how to avoid cameras, how to target the most vulnerable part of the system. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She photographed every inch, noted the damage, and called the police. The officer who arrived was young, polite, and clearly unsure of how seriously to take the situation. There was no break-in, no suspect, no clear evidence. But Leslie insisted on a report. She showed him the binder, the footage, the letter from the lawyers, the fake utility notice. She didn't make accusations. She just laid it all out, calmly, methodically. The officer left, promising to pass it along. Leslie did not believe he would. She spent the next 3 hours on the phone, not with friends, not with neighbors, but with service providers. She scheduled an immediate inspection with a hazardous materials specialist. She contacted the landscaping contractor who had built her system and asked for a rush consultation. She made a formal request for soil testing through the county's Agricultural Extension Office. Everything documented, everything legal, and then she sat on her back porch with a flashlight and waited. Not with a weapon, not with a plan for confrontation, just silence, listening. The next day, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived, real postage, real envelope, from someone she didn't know. A woman named Meredith on the next block. The handwriting was tight, nervous, but clear. Inside the note, Meredith explained that she had seen someone crouched near Leslie's property line late at night, around the time of the flood. She hadn't told anyone, afraid, she said, but she had heard rumors, half-whispers from other residents that Karen was going after the new woman on the street. Meredith didn't want to get involved, but she also didn't want to see anyone hurt. Leslie read the letter twice. It wasn't a confession or a witness statement, but it was validation. From within the hive. She wrote back cautiously, a thank you, nothing more. She didn't ask Meredith to testify or speak publicly. That wasn't the point. The point was this. The silence was cracking. The game Karen played, control through insinuation, dominance through proxies, depended on unanimity. But now, even if Meredith remained anonymous, she had fractured the illusion. Leslie took that momentum and made a quiet decision. She called her system designer and asked for a modification. Not to the function, not to the purpose, but to the plumbing, an auxiliary channel, not active, but capable of rerouting overflow from the emergency tank to a secondary, external output. The engineer didn't ask questions. He just built it. Technically, it wasn't against code. It was a precaution. 3 days later, it rained again. Not a storm, just a steady, persistent drizzle. Leslie's system filled as designed, excess draining neatly into the filtration bed. But this time she watched the auxiliary channel too, not activating it, just observing. She knew where it connected. She knew what the water would do if she allowed it. But for now, she left the valve closed. Across the street, Karen was on her porch, sipping coffee, staring. Her lawn was half replanted, her garden gone. Her front stoop was wrapped in black contractor bags, the sign of delayed repairs. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. She just stared. Leslie stared back. Neither blinked. And in that stillness, in that quiet electric space between two parcels of land, something locked into place. The next move wouldn't be random. The game had rules now. And Leslie was done playing defense. The rainfall came unexpectedly heavy that Saturday. The weather apps had forecast only light showers, but by late morning, the sky turned an industrial gray, the wind picked up, and water fell in thick sheets that pounded against windows, soaked garden beds, and roared through gutter systems like a broken dam. Leslie was ready. Her system had been calibrated for overflow weeks in advance. The tanks rotated their intake automatically, pressure sensors flicked from yellow to green, and the auxiliary channel sat in wait, sealed, inactive, but now no longer hypothetical. By noon, runoff from her roof and sloped garden beds filled the primary tanks to 80%. She monitored everything from her desk, sipping tea, watching the animated diagram update in real time. The northern filter was holding. The secondary reservoir engaged at 1:43 p.m. The rain intensified. Across the street, Karen's property sagged under the pressure. Her temporary landscaping couldn't handle water absorption. The soil was too loose, the grading too shallow. Puddles formed by 2:15 p.m., deepened by 2:30. At 3:10, Leslie saw the first visible breach, an arc of water pouring from the base of Karen's garage door, streaming like a river down her driveway. Her trench drains weren't working. No crews arrived. No response from Karen either. The curtains on her ground floor remained closed. At 3:22 p.m., Leslie stood by her back window and did nothing. She didn't activate the auxiliary valve. She didn't open the channel. But she didn't need to. Karen's system, whatever patchwork of pipes and pumps she had cobbled together after her own sabotage, was now reacting against itself. The water that spilled from Karen's yard didn't trace back to Leslie's system, but rather from Karen's own overflow line. Leslie had always suspected Karen had tried to redirect runoff using a buried pipe during one of her replanting projects. Now that line was betraying her. By 4 p.m., police had arrived. Not sirens, just a patrol vehicle parked discreetly at the curb, the officer standing near the mailbox in a plastic poncho, listening as Karen pointed furiously toward Leslie's property. Leslie stepped outside slowly, umbrella in hand, and approached the officer only when waved over. Karen was mid-sentence, gesturing with a clipboard and laminated page. Some kind of unverified schematic she must have printed online. The officer, young but professional, glanced at Leslie with a tired expression. "She says your irrigation is pushing water under her foundation," he said plainly. Leslie looked at Karen's document. It was a screenshot from a landscaping website overlaid with red arrows drawn in a program like Paint. Not a certified diagram. No stamps. No metadata. "I have stamped engineering diagrams, full permit documentation, and a system certified by 2 independent environmental engineers," Leslie replied evenly. "Would you like to see them?" Karen interrupted. "She's redirecting water. I don't care what papers she has. It's deliberate." "I haven't touched my system today," Leslie said. "Not a single valve, not even a manual override. You're welcome to review the system log." She held up her phone with the interface ready. The officer hesitated, took the phone, scrolled, nodded, then handed it back. Karen seethed. The officer turned to her and said, "Ma'am, unless you can present actual technical evidence or request a civil engineer to inspect, there's nothing we can enforce here." "But she's using rain like it's her private reservoir." "It's rain," the officer said simply, then offered a non-committal nod and walked away. Leslie returned inside without another word. She didn't smile. She didn't even feel satisfaction. Only a deepening sense of what Karen was willing to do when her words no longer held weight. That night, Leslie opened her back gate quietly and stepped into the yard. She carried no tools, no flashlights. The air still smelled like rain. She crouched by the system's control panel and stared at the auxiliary valve for a long time, unmoving. It was not revenge she wanted, not destruction. What she needed was clarity. Proof that when pushed, her actions would speak louder than accusation. She ran a final diagnostics check. She locked the panel. She went to sleep. The next morning brought calm skies and a different sound. Machinery. Karen's driveway was being ripped open again. 2 new contractors, both unfamiliar, installed industrial pumps. Leslie noticed the arrival of someone in a blue blazer with a clipboard. A private insurance investigator, perhaps. Leslie watched the way Karen spoke to him. Animated, pleading, hand-waving. She didn't cry. Karen never cried. She insisted. She repeated. She pointed. And when the man walked over toward Leslie's property line, Leslie met him at the gate before he even stepped foot past it. He introduced himself politely, asked if she had time for a few questions. "Only if you can prove legal standing," Leslie replied. He smiled, handed her a card. "Private adjuster, hired by Karen's insurance." Leslie nodded. "I'll email my compliance package. You're not obligated to cooperate, but—" "I'm not. But I will," she said, "as long as your questions stay within statute." He didn't press further. She sent him the documents that night, and that was the moment it became clear. Karen wasn't just losing the conflict. She was losing the narrative. No one on the street had offered her public support. No one posted online. No flyers, no Facebook group threads. Just quiet. And that silence was starting to sound like isolation. The next evening, Leslie found a new letter at her door. Not taped, not mailed. Slid under the mat. It read, "You're playing with more than water. Be careful." No signature, no symbol, but the message was crystal. She didn't call the police. She called the environmental compliance officer who had inspected her tanks last spring. "Can you do a follow-up site report?" she asked. "Same scope. I'll pay double." He came the next day. As he walked the perimeter, he noticed something odd. An unusual bump in the ground behind the fence between Leslie's property and the community greenbelt. A plastic pipe, capped. They dug down a foot. Disconnected. No pressure. Not part of any known system. The inspector photographed it, measured, then said, "Someone was trying to tap into your overflow." Leslie only nodded. Now she had everything. Motive, evidence, timing. But she still hadn't opened the valve, and yet the water had already started to move. By the time the fourth week of rainfall began, the neighborhood was no longer pretending everything was fine. Lawn chairs were stacked and tied down. Garden flags were removed, and front porches began to sprout stacks of sandbags like defensive perimeters around miniature castles. The soil, exhausted and saturated beyond capacity, could no longer hold the illusion of suburban calm. Everything was soft, swollen, and just barely restrained. Leslie felt it too, not just in her garden, but in the way the ground beneath the social fabric of her street had begun to buckle. She received no more messages from Karen. No notes, no complaints, not even a passive-aggressive gesture from across the road. But the absence of noise was more sinister than the confrontation. Karen's silence was not surrender. It was the silence of recalibration. One morning, Leslie woke to find her mailbox open. Not broken, not vandalized, just open, lid dangling, no letter inside. She closed it carefully but made a mental note. That afternoon, her water pressure dropped without warning. The readings on her system's digital dashboard showed a 40% reduction in input velocity, but no internal issue. She checked the primary filter, clean. She tested the tank valve, responsive. Something was choking the line upstream. That night, she received an alert from her driveway motion sensor. A car parked briefly just outside camera range, headlights off, engine silent. By the time she stepped outside with a flashlight, it was gone. The next morning, she found the gate sensor cable cut. Clean, deliberate, not chewed or weather-worn. She didn't react outwardly. She replaced the cable, installed a second one in a false conduit, and scheduled a private inspection of all visible infrastructure. No failures were found. But by then, the signs were unavoidable. Someone was tampering with the system from the outside, and not with the intention of disabling it. They were looking for control points. Karen was no longer just reacting. She was escalating on a new front. Through proxy, through sabotage that left no traceable fingerprints. Leslie made no announcement. She simply rewired the auxiliary channel, this time installing a secure access relay that allowed her to control it only through a physical key interface, no longer accessible remotely or through software. She also rerouted the runoff not to the main drain system, but through a gravel pit lined in camouflage tubing, redirecting the overflow line to a retention basin under the far end of her property. From above, nothing had changed. But now, if the water moved, it would move without detection. Across the street, Karen's house remained stoically unchanged, but something had shifted behind the scenes. 2 new vehicles began parking in her driveway, black sedans with temporary plates. Once, Leslie saw a man in a charcoal overcoat walk inside holding a silver case, the kind architects or litigation consultants might use. The man didn't look like a contractor. He looked like someone brought in to find fault. On Wednesday, 2 plainclothes city officials arrived at Leslie's door. Their demeanor was professional, clipped but polite. They requested to examine her property under a routine compliance sweep, a vague term that usually preceded bureaucratic pressure. Leslie didn't refuse. She handed them copies of her permits, showed them the recent environmental assessment report, walked them through every visible component of her system. They took no samples, asked no accusatory questions. But their presence was meant to signal one thing. The pressure was now institutional. When they left, Leslie sat in her study and stared at the monitor displaying her system's data. Her tanks were 78% full. Her filtration system showed minor fluctuations, nothing alarming. The pressure readings from the auxiliary remained flat. But the psychological terrain had shifted. She was no longer the outlier being watched. She had become the problem to be managed. That evening, she walked her property boundary line with a notepad and pen, marking each place where the soil had shifted or where footprints remained fresh despite no known visitors. She documented everything. She also contacted the city and submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for all formal complaints filed against her address in the past 90 days. The clerk, somewhat amused, told her it would take 2 weeks. 3 days later, another anonymous letter arrived, this time placed in a plain envelope with only her name written in pencil. The message inside was short. If you keep pushing, someone's going to get hurt. Might not be you. Leslie filed a formal police report. This time she asked for the officer's badge number, took a photo of the report slip, and forwarded everything to her attorney. But what changed wasn't her fear. It was her patience. That night, the storm returned with unusual intensity. The wind bent trees sideways, shingles rattled, and water slammed down in rhythmic, vengeful bursts. Leslie's system, for all its precision, couldn't mask the sound of water roaring through PVC and iron. She stood barefoot in her hallway, watching the readings rise. Tank 1 full, tank 2 full, overflow pending. By 2 a.m., the auxiliary reached its pressure threshold. She unlocked the panel. She turned the key. The channel opened. She didn't watch where it went. She didn't follow the pipe. She simply monitored the pressure release. Smooth, calibrated, lawful. The system was operating exactly as it had been designed. Not weaponized. Just optimized. If the pipe happened to connect to an area behind her property where illegal trenching had occurred, well, that was not her doing. She had built for sustainability. She had adapted under duress. By sunrise, her system had returned to baseline. Across the street, Karen's lawn was again a marsh. The plastic barrier set up along her foundation had collapsed, flattened by the cumulative pressure of a full night's water movement. A puddle extended from her front steps to the edge of the sidewalk. No emergency vehicles arrived. No contractors appeared. But someone had called the police. Leslie watched as 2 patrol cars pulled up quietly. One officer walked to Karen's door. The other walked around her side yard, clipboard in hand. Leslie stepped outside onto her porch, pretending to examine a planter box, and caught their exchange. Karen was red-faced, damp, pacing in a poncho. She gestured wildly at Leslie's house, repeated something about engineered flooding. But the officer didn't approach Leslie. He didn't knock. He didn't issue a warning. He simply nodded, made a note, and walked back to the cruiser. A moment later, he crossed the street. He looked at Leslie and said calmly, "You've got a pretty sophisticated system there." "I do," she said. "You're welcome to inspect it." He smiled slightly. "Already did. Looked up your permits. Everything's clean. We're just here because someone insisted." "I understand." "You be safe out here," he said. "People get ideas when they feel cornered." "I'm not the one in a corner," Leslie replied. He nodded again and left. That night, she didn't lock the valve. She left it open. Not out of spite, out of necessity. Because some battles weren't about defeating the enemy. They were about controlling the terrain. And the water, now, was very much under her control. It was never about water. Leslie had understood that months ago. Water was simply the tool, an invisible force, a fluid medium through which pressure, suspicion, and power could be transferred without fingerprints. But now, with the storms growing stronger and the soil of the neighborhood itself becoming unpredictable, what had begun as a passive conflict of nuisance and retaliation had curdled into a deeper, more dangerous game. And it was no longer just between her and Karen. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by certified mail and signed in blue ink by a man Leslie didn't know. It was an official summons. Civil litigation had been filed. Karen was suing. The charge was straightforward but outrageous. Intentional redirection of excess water runoff resulting in property damage, mental distress, and degradation of land value. Leslie read the document 3 times without blinking. It was thin, flimsy, but it was real. And in the eyes of the system, real enough meant time, money, and exposure. She didn't panic. She scanned the document, sent it to her attorney, and opened the file she had been quietly building since the first sign of sabotage. Every incident, every inspection, every independent analysis, including the environmental reports and third-party verification of her infrastructure's legality. It was all there. What Karen didn't know, and perhaps never understood, was that while Leslie had stayed silent on the surface, she had never stopped preparing for the moment someone forced her hand. Karen had filed her suit under the assumption that Leslie would either fold from pressure or settle out of exhaustion. But Leslie wasn't interested in compromise anymore. She wanted light. She wanted process. And most of all, she wanted public record. The pretrial hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Karen made no direct contact during that time. No gestures, no threats, no theatrics. But Leslie noticed the difference in how the neighbors looked at her. More curious than before, less uncertain. Someone had clearly been whispering narratives. The woman across the street with the gadgets and tanks. The one who always seemed calm. Maybe too calm. What was she hiding? Let them ask, Leslie thought. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was almost empty. Just Karen, her lawyer, an older man with a poorly fitted suit, and Leslie with her own counsel. A modest judge presided, sharp-eyed and efficient. He listened as Karen's lawyer laid out their argument. Excessive water flow from Leslie's system had, they claimed, destabilized the soil around Karen's foundation, causing a cascading sequence of problems that resulted in flooding, stress, and financial burden. There was no proof, only assertions and selectively cropped photos taken at odd angles. Leslie watched in silence, expression unreadable. When it was her turn, her attorney stood calmly, presented documents in order, building permits, the drainage compliance certificate, signed inspection reports, and a time-stamped log from the system's central control panel, showing exactly when valves had opened and at what capacity. Then came the surprise. A report from the city engineer who had quietly inspected Karen's side of the property line and noted the presence of unauthorized piping installed without permit, tracing directly back toward a tampered junction box behind Leslie's garden wall. The judge asked for clarification. Yes, the inspector wrote in the report, the subject property's infrastructure was targeted by an illegal secondary tap, which appears to have been added after the original dispute began. Karen's face didn't change, but her posture did. Shoulders tight, jaw locked. The judge flipped through the report silently, then turned to Karen's counsel and asked, "Do you have an engineering counter-analysis?" The lawyer cleared his throat. We're in the process of obtaining one." The judge nodded once. "That should have preceded your claim. I'm dismissing the case without prejudice. You may refile when you have certified evidence. For now, there's no basis for further action." It was quiet as they exited the courtroom. Karen walked several paces ahead of her attorney, her heels hitting the tile in short, angry bursts. Leslie didn't speak. She didn't look back. Her steps were slower, measured, her breathing even. But the battle wasn't over. Later that week, someone broke the lock on her side gate again. No theft, no damage. Just the lock, twisted and tossed in the grass. A message. The process hadn't worked, so now it was personal. That night, as the sky shifted from dusk to deep purple, Leslie sat on her porch and watched the lights flicker across the street. Karen's house was dark in all but one room. The office, the one that faced the side yard. Leslie didn't stare. She simply took note. Then the storm came. Not just rain, but wind, thunder. A sudden, brutal squall that pushed the drainage systems of the entire neighborhood past their limits. Gutters vomited water. Power lines groaned. At 1:17 a.m., Leslie's system triggered an emergency redirect, something that had never happened before. The tank sensors flashed red. Water had breached the usual parameters. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her coat, and ran outside. The problem wasn't her tanks. It was the line under the eastern side fence. The unauthorized pipe, buried months ago by Karen's original crew, had fractured under pressure, and now it was flooding both properties. Leslie watched in horror as water surged backward toward her control box, the panel blinking erratically. If it shorted, the entire filtration circuit would fail, and the overflow would rise, uncontrolled. She acted quickly, flipping the emergency cutoff, sealing the auxiliary valve, and activating the gravel channel redirect. It worked, just barely. But not before a wave of water spilled onto the eastern edge of her yard, carrying with it clumps of disturbed earth, bits of broken PVC, and a small rectangular object wrapped in black plastic. She retrieved it the next morning. It was a camera, waterproof, battery-powered, buried facing her garden. Someone had been recording. She filed the final police report that afternoon. She didn't expect prosecution, but she expected documentation. Her lawyer made copies, attached them to a cease and desist, and hand-delivered it to Karen's address with a witness present. No one answered the door. A week later, the house went quiet. Karen's car disappeared. A moving van appeared 2 days after that. By the end of the week, the for sale sign was up. Weatherproof, sleek, freshly installed. No explanation. No goodbye. Just an absence. Suddenly absolute. Leslie stood by her garden and turned the key to the auxiliary valve one final time. Then she locked it. For good. The silence that followed Karen's departure wasn't immediate. For the first few days after the moving van pulled away, the house remained strangely animate. Lights flickered at odd hours, the porch camera swiveled occasionally, and timers still ran the front yard lighting system as if trying to simulate presence. But the mail stopped. The carport stayed empty. No more early morning walks, no more extended gazes across the street. Just vacancy, slowly setting like dust on an untouched shelf. And in that space, in the void left behind by a presence once so commanding, The neighborhood began to breathe differently. Leslie didn't mark the date of Karen's exit with celebration. There were no final words exchanged, no dramatic closure, no triumphant reclaiming of narrative. What she felt instead was something quieter, deeper, a return of weightless footing, like removing soaked boots after a long storm. Her garden, resilient despite weeks of stress and interference, had begun to recover. New shoots rose where soil had been compacted. The air smelled clean again. She spent her mornings tending to the damaged zones with a calm diligence, not as restoration, but as reassertion. The system was hers. The water was hers. And the land, after all its forced obedience to someone else's paranoia, was finally behaving as it was meant to. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance began to speak again. Not effusively, not with false warmth, but with the quiet sincerity of people who had been watching and perhaps regretting their inaction. A man from 3 houses down approached her at the community mailboxes, mentioned in passing that he was glad it was over. A younger couple walking their dog nodded with more than routine politeness. The woman who had once written the anonymous letter, Meredith, dropped off a small basket of homemade muffins on Leslie's porch with a note that simply read, "Thank you for holding the line." None of it was dramatic. None of it was broadcast. But it was acknowledgement, and that was more than Leslie ever expected. A few weeks later, the house across the street was listed online with a carefully edited description. Recently vacated home with minor water damage, updated drainage in progress, available for quick sale. Leslie didn't monitor the offers, but she noticed when a small white sedan began parking in the driveway on weekends. A woman, maybe in her late 30s, clean-cut, wore canvas gloves and carried a notepad as she walked the perimeter. Leslie watched her from her porch once, noting how the woman paused near the old trench site behind the hydrangeas and scribbled something. No eye contact, no intrusion, just presence. And for the first time in months, Leslie felt no need to track or interpret that presence. Whoever came next would build their own terms. And this time, the soil would remember what had been allowed and what had been endured. She didn't dismantle her system. She didn't scale it back or reconfigure it for subtlety. She maintained it. She cleaned the filters, updated the sensors, reinforced the underground channeling, and left the auxiliary valve secured with a mechanical lock, its keys stored in a drawer she hadn't opened since the final flood. The system wasn't a weapon, and it never had been. It was clarity given form, discipline in infrastructure, elegance in function, truth in pressure. The water flowed only where permitted, and Leslie had ensured that every inch of that permission was documented, recorded, protected. On the last weekend of spring, she hosted a small gathering in her backyard. Not a party, not a spectacle, just a handful of people who had quietly supported her through the quieter parts of the conflict. There was no speech, no need. Just hands in the soil, shared wine, a few laughs, and a table lit by soft garden LEDs. At one point, someone asked about the pipe system, how it worked, what it cost, whether it had been worth it. Leslie only smiled, her gaze drifting toward the smooth rise of earth where the auxiliary had once released its hidden current. "It's not about the water," she said finally. "It's about where you draw your lines." There were nods. No one pushed further. When the guests left and the lights dimmed, Leslie remained outside a little longer, barefoot on the cool stones, the smell of wet earth clinging gently to her. In the distance, thunder rolled, too far off to threaten, close enough to stir memory. She tilted her head, listening. The rain would come again, as it always did, but this time the land would answer only to her.